This is, of course, Dialogue Conspiracy. I'm Phil Kogan, and as is every week, Mae Brussell is in the studio. Good afternoon, Mae.
Hi, Phil.
I caught you in the middle of reading The Realist, which is going to make up a good portion of Dialogue Conspiracy today for a good reason. Mae Brussell wrote most of it.
Well,
the whole back of the magazine is Mae Brussell's writing. That's the August 72 issue of The Realist.
I'm sitting here reading and I can't do the show. I was looking to see. I thought Paul left out part of the way I wrote one of the articles. He turned it around and put the beginning as the conclusion, and I'm looking here and I thought, oh, why did he do that? You know, he didn't change much of the articles. As a publisher, he wasn't going to change any, but he twisted one of the articles around and put the conclusion as the.
Which article is that?
Well, we'll go into this. We're going to talk about The Realist today. That's the magazine I've been talking about. On Dialogue Assassination and Dialogue Conspiracy, we talk about the methods by which the government is controlled or overthrown. And Paul Krasner, editor of Realist, is going to put out a newspaper. He'll publish it and I'll write it, coming out every 2 weeks, called Conspiracy Newsletter, giving facts and information. It all came because of this show, Phil, because giving out all these facts, people want to know the sources of information or where I got my material. And there's a lot of feedback. People write, what books can I read? Where can I get information? And so after that long show in New York City on WBAI and being here every week, and the response to this kind of show, Paul thought people should have access to this information across the country.
In fact, the program got mentioned in The Realist on page 4.
Yes.
I note, underlined in orange ink.
Okay, did you underline it already? It mentions this particular station, KLRB, and what are his exact words? This far out radio station, KLRB in Carmel, an hour a week of dandy documentation. In the back of the articles, there's one article on how Nixon came to power, and an example of documentation. There's 42 footnotes, 41 and 2 inside the article, on just 2.5 columns. So if you want to do your homework now, you can do it. As a matter of fact, we were up at Lennon's, John and Yoko Lennon's yesterday, and we were having a long conversation about their problems, and they have problems in this country, as many of you know, and we'll talk about them in a minute. And as we were talking, I was mentioning a book, and John said to the fellow who works for them and who's with them, Peter, take that down and get it. It was Richard Nixon's My Sixth Crisis. And I was talking about the funding of Richard Nixon. I was pertaining to that book. But there comes a point in your life, and it's a question of survival. It's a question of your survival or mine or John Lennon's, and you need facts or information, and you have to read, and you have to stop. At some point, even playing music or listening music. That doesn't mean you give it all up, but you have to, at some time, be very serious and begin to get information or documentation about what's happening. You can't just sit in a drawing room and say, isn't this like 1984? If you think 72 is 84, read some books and find out how it became that way so you can halt the progress. See, it seems that 1984 is a very dangerous book for one reason, Phil, and I was talking about that last night with my son Marvin. By saying in 1984 these things will be here, people accept that as the deadline and think now is good. You follow what I'm saying? It becomes a dangerous concept because people say, oh, wow, they have these cameras where they can go across the street and photograph everyone in my house, everything I'm doing. Isn't that bad? And people say, well, that's almost like 1984, where they'll do the whole block. But because it's just your house or that house, it's only 72, and 72 is good. We're really
we've got
lucky.
12 good years left.
Yeah, that's what I mean. You see the concept of accepting the data or information that's happening, like the new NASA Telestar that can get the fish pools and the forests and photograph the Earth's surfaces that went up this week, that was planned years ago by the same German rocket scientists, that Hitler had developing in Germany, that were nurtured and brought up in this country. They can know where the fish pools are, where the forests are, where the water is. They control it, and they can tell the boats where to go or what countries to negotiate or where the fishing boat should go. You say, well, you're controlling all the food of the earth that way if you control the source of the water and the forest and the fish, and the animal life. You control the man then, because you control his stomach. And that stomach makes the energy work, the factories work, the man works. And if you don't feed him, you know, if you hold off his food, he dies. Therefore, he has to work. He has to go into the mines or the coal fields or cut the trees. You control his food, you control his stomach, then you control the machinery that goes around, that makes the country work, that makes it possible for the arms to be manufactured, the wars to be waged. And it's a vicious circle, and as long as those things are up, and it's only, they've got the things working now to keep track of all the animal life or vegetation. Well, this is 72. Aren't we lucky? You know, they're not doing anything with it yet.
Let's go back to the Realist that we mentioned. First of all, for people who aren't familiar with it, where can they get it once it's out on the well, we have our unbound advanced copies of the August 72 issue.
Well, we have a little local problem here. The Realist has always been by subscription. The address is here. To subscribe to the Realist magazine is Realist Department 93. And then Paul has an address in the magazine that's different than the one we had before. Box 379, Stuyvesant Station, Stuyvesant Station, New York 10009. I'll leave a copy here at the station if somebody wants to call in and get that address. I'm hoping, you know, that the Thunderbird will carry some special issues of this because of the local interest. And this story, particularly the Martha Mitchell story, but the others will be breaking in the news, hopefully, and we will be meeting, you know, a lot of news people, particularly on the Martha Mitchell, John Mitchell story, and there'll be interest in this. I hope there better be, because it's, you know, the Mitchell story is a really important story. And I hope Thunderbird or local bookstores, maybe. The Odyssey said they would carry them. I'll have to get in touch with them. You know, Paul will have to do that to see where people can pick it up. But that's not my problem. I wrote it, and he distributes it for New York, and that's all I know.
Okay. Now, into the article itself, it might be interesting. I don't know how important it is, how you got to know Paul. Maybe you went into this when he was on the show a couple of weeks back.
No, we didn't. I met him when I was reading The Realist the first of the year, and he made a comment that in one of his issues he was sued by the Scientologists because he was going to write a story how Sirhan was working his way up in Scientology. So the Scientologists sued him large, $1 million, something more than that, suit for slamming their name, you know, slandering their name. So I was going to call New York. I looked up the address where the subscription came from to offer my information on Sirhan, and the fact that the Scientologist was a cover for the real assassins that really did it, just like the communist, so-called communist, Fair Play for Cuba was a cover for Oswald. He actually was Navy intelligence, and Fair Play for Cuba gets slandered, and Civil Liberties Union gets slandered, and he wasn't even into those things, you see, but they sent him before his assignment, before the role that he played in the killing of Kennedy. They had him just 2 weeks before go to a meeting of the American Civil Liberties Union. And then, when they say, well, who's this assassin? They say, oh, he joined the Civil Liberties Union last month.
So that's... So
I called New York, and I got saw on the subscription thing that there was an address in San Francisco on Vallejo Street, and I called there, and there's a recording, and then the phone went down here where Paul lives in Watsonville, and then I reached him there, which was close to home. It was much easier than New York. And after we talked about Sirhan, he said, well, what do you know about Charlie Manson? He's doing his story on the parts left out of the Manson book. Paul's famous for these things that he puts in The Realist. He takes these books and puts what should have been there, what they left out, you know, like the parts left out of the Manchester book. So he's doing one on the Manson. I said, well, I know as much as anyone in the country about the real intent and plan in using Charlie Manson and the purposes of coming down on the hippies, that it was a framed massacre. It was not a thing where one man went berserk and trained a bunch of chicks. You know, Charlie didn't even kill anybody. So Paul came down, and we spent a couple of days just going over a lot of material because he's into the mainstream of everything that happens in this country. But they were linked coincidences to him, and he didn't take them as conspiracy. As a matter of fact, in the conspiracy newsletter, he wrote a word that I changed his whole opinion about what was happening in America to what he said. he said, Mae is truth-seeking in her discipline. Knowing her, I've undergone a religious conversion from believing in coincidence to believing in conspiracy. It's interesting that he calls it a religious conversion, because a lot of people may think that's funny or they take it lightly. But when you're laughing all your life and you're the jester or the funny man and you're one of the greatest satirists in the country, and you see the double side of everything, the serious and the funny, and you can say it, and laugh at it. And when you begin to see it as a very serious thing and what it really is, it's a very hard thing to admit and to go through that change. This is why I have trouble with most people listening to why there were political conspiracies in this country, because they're not willing to go through the metamorphosis that Krasner's going through, the pain or the prolonging of what you're doing, stalling off your work, laughing, happy-go-lucky, clowning around, being with a lot of people, and isn't this jolly kind of thing. Paul has given that up into a much more serious vein and accepted some of the things that I have said as being possible and looking into them himself as being true. And ask yourself, does it hurt? Yes, it hurts a lot. It hurts very much, to find out what's happening. But that's what makes Paul Krasner, and makes John Lennon, or makes people really come above the ordinary person who refuses to open his mind. We all have the same potential to do it, but the person who refuses to do it stays at a certain level, and the other person goes through the glory and the pain, which is what a religious conversion is. It has its glory and its pain. Yesterday we spent the day with John and Yoko Lennon, and Paul and I took my kids up because we've been Beatle fans for years, ever since the first album. I took the kids to Candlestick Park to see them up in San Francisco years ago. This is a lot easier to just go upstairs and, sit around on the floor and have lunch and spend the whole day and just rap. But what's happened in the years since we were Beatle fans, I guess when we go to Candlestick it was around 66. And what's happened in the interim of 66 to 72? Of course, you're so young, Phil, like I look at this back of that panorama, historic panorama, and there were the Beatles at the height of their career, but then they were almost killed because the publicity that he was as important as Jesus, or the remarks that went around, they'll remember him as long as Jesus, made a lot of religious people ready to kill him. And at that point, their life was in danger, physical danger, from people who didn't like the comparison, and furthermore were afraid of what they were doing. So we spent a whole day, and a change happened. This wasn't the happy-go-lucky John that was flipping around years ago, having a hell of a ball and free from all of society's entrapments, and he could wear his hair how he wanted, and he could sing how he wanted, and live with who he wanted, and live it up to the hill with the fancy Rolls Royce, the 70-room mansion, and have a ball in his own recording studio, and life was a ball. And he was a clown, sort of like Krasner was a clown. They were just gay. They were having fun. It was a gaiety about the whole damn thing. And meanwhile, the world was falling apart. And
now things are a little more serious.
Well, they're serious because, what we were trying to rap about up there, and this is a very loose show, just trying to think of the things that happen and share them with the people that are listening, is that what he didn't understand, John Lennon, was that he was a social phenomena or a force. And he knew he was. The Beatles were a force. Bob Dylan was a force. But Bob Dylan's a prisoner, too, of the CIA. He's in a compound. He's in a wall. Like John's a prisoner. And you can't believe that, but he is. Because while he was laughing and kicking and freeing people, freeing the young people to think for themselves and to sing and to relate and to communicate, the boss didn't like it. Boss man isn't having that fun, and Tricia and Julie aren't having that fun, and he doesn't want America thinking for themselves. The education that they were supposed to get wasn't supposed to work that way. So the kids dropped out. You were supposed to stay in college and be part of the corporation, or get your job and be glad you worked for Bank of America, and say, thank you, sir. But the kids saw that something was wrong, and they dropped out, and the Beatles were singing, and the FM stations, the AM, and the underground press were telling some truths, and the boss man doesn't like that, and he gets mad. And so what I was trying to say to the Lennons is, they're a social force, and they are meeting Nixon and Mitchell head on. And they Kissinger, they say, get out of our country. We don't want you. Like, not thank you for what you did. Thank you for those sounds. You go up in the elevator at Rockefeller Center, the Muzak has the Beatles. But they won't play it on a lot of stations in the country now, the new songs. You know, they are a force meeting the power structure head on, because this is the year that they take control, or the youth, the populist people control. And this is 72, and I said this would be the apex, the deciding point in America of how things would happen, and the Beatles are important in that. So what are they doing? They're sitting there, and they're telling a story that's very tragic, but which happened to Oswald, it happened to Sirhan, it happened to Ray, it happened to John Lennon. He moves from one house to another, and somebody takes a binoculars, and they move his things. And he doesn't move everything. He's John Lennon. He has a moving company in France. And they move his things. He's in a new place. And the police make a bust. And they encircle the place like they're enemies of the state. The whole army comes in. Police force. And they go through their possessions. And there's some binoculars there. And they have grass in them. Well, John doesn't say anything because, you know, he thinks, well, maybe they're Paul's or they belong to George. And he's not going to pin the rap on them. It's just grass and their binoculars. The police department comes in, and this is in London, or outside of London. And they say, oh, look, if you sign this paper that you're guilty for this grass, you know, like there's a certain fine. Well, at this point, he was living with Yoko, and England was angry at him for living with Yoko because he stopped being a commodity like a grapefruit or so many dozen oranges that you sell, and the Beatles were a commodity in England. Britain loved them. They were a market. When Yoko comes in and John says, look, I want to be a human being. I'm John Lennon. I have all this bread. And now I found the woman I love. I love her. And I am a person. I'm not a quadruplet. I'm not a Siamese twin. I'm John, and I love Yoko. And they were living together, and she's Japanese. And then the papers in England say, get that ugly jab out of town. And he said, this is what they actually publish in the paper. She's breaking up our Beatles. Get that woman. They refer to her in those terms, in her racial slurs and the way they were living, and they referred to them in the ugliest language they could do, still do, in the press, because they took our Beatles. She took our Beatles.
So they're using, the United States is using that drug bust, the marijuana bust, for reason to deport John and
exactly.
Yoko.
And they work with Heath and Nixon are one. They say England's a 59th state. So what happens is they say sign a paper and maybe pays a fine. I forget the details, $1,000 something. Say it was your grass. That's all it is. Yoko can stay in this country. She won't be deported. Fine. So he signs a paper that the grass and the binoculars was his, because why should he get George in trouble, whoever it was? Somebody moved it. They're not even his binoculars. He doesn't know what they're there for, but he's there. If it's only $1,000 and Yoko isn't deported, it's only grass. He says, yeah. So then Yoko is American. She's Japanese, but she's married to an American man. Her child was born in America, so they knew someday she'd wander back to America. So when it comes to America, they say, no, she can come back, but you can't. Come into America. You have grass. And that's where they clamp the law. You were busted on grass.
What's the status of that now?
Well, they have appealed to everybody. Now, I thought, when I read that they were here, and I wondered how many Beatle fans would actually write to the State Department and say, will you please respect them as artists and human beings and forget that grass law that almost everyone in Washington is smoking the stuff, you know they are, and quit the hypocrisy and let John Lennon in this country. I wish now that people listening to this show would just make a note, get a pencil or write down, and write the State Department. Or Cranston, not Talcott. He doesn't want that kind of thing in this country. You know where his head's at. But write to Cranston or Tunney or the State Department or McGovern or somebody and say, please let the Lennons stay in this country. If you have a Beatle album and you've listened to their music and they've given you something, why can't you out there give them something? That's what people should be doing in this world. This is what they're not doing. They let even the people they like down. You know, you have two problems here. You have your enemy, which is a spy government like the Central Intelligence Agency that controls so much of what happens and plants evidence in the Justice Department. Then the other enemy is yourself, your own lazy selves. You don't stick by your friends. There's no loyalty. That's the other enemy, is your own self. You turn down the people that give you music, and the result is you're getting bad music these days, and it's going to get worse, and you don't stick by your loyal friends. so people could write into the State Department and say, help these people. So now they say, well, she can stay because her child's here, but he has to go. So then he had another experience where he's in London and he's doing his thing and he receives a letter from a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist has a new theory of how to handle relationships, and he's supposed to be a good psychiatrist. And he's in Los Angeles at the time the Lennons were there, and they went to him for 6 months. The whole time that they were in therapy, the man helped John. He didn't help Yoko because he believes in separation of the races. He doesn't believe that blacks should marry white or white should marry Japanese or Mexican American. And he hated, he told, John to divorce her. He tried to break up the marriage and get her out and away from him, and he hates women. Well, the man came down on them so hard, and Yoko was very depressed and hurt because, they left England, and they finally found somebody for each of them that they loved very much. And this man tried, to break her from him, which could be part of a whole conspiracy thing, again, which they have to go into, which I would go into, and which I would like to help them, with my research as a friend, just as a human being. Who's doing these things to them, trying to do these things? Because, see, I don't think they just happen. I know the Manson thing and the Sharon Tate thing was to come down on the hippies, and they used helter-skelter and tried to get the Lennons into that. And it is a serious thing to see. They represent a lot of things, just like the Tex Watson killing. Tex Watson killed everyone in the Sharon Tate home. And this white Christian boy, not the little Charlie Manson, the ex-prisoner, the great lover, and the violent hippie, but the non-hippie, Charles Watson, did all the massacres. And he leaves death to the pigs on the door with Sharon Tate's blood and wants you to think the Panthers did it. And later in the testimony, they admitted leaving part of La Bianca. Those were 2 people that were killed the next night after the Tate massacre, leaving their credit cards in the black part of town, hoping people would get mad at the blacks and think they killed the white Mr. and Mrs. Whitey watching their television, Middle America, that the blacks did that. Well, if they admit they planted that, they planted the helter-skelter, too. The whole thing, the helter-skelter was part of it to come down. If the whole massacre was to come down on the hippies, they could come down on the Beatles, too. And they tried to bring him there for the trial and get into another scene, which he wouldn't answer. So it's a different scene now in 72 than it was in 66 or 67 when Sgt. Pepper, that Far Out album was out. And those were the days, I look back and I was doing my work then and telling everybody, look, do your music, but listen to what I'm saying too. Every hippie I picked up, everyone that came to my house, everyone I've known, and writers and professional people, and I'd say there's something else too. Like I could go to Monterey Pop and take all the kids and get tickets for every concert and appreciate those artists, musicians, as musicians and the changes in our society. But for every change, there's a price. You don't break it easy.
Speaking of changes, for those of you out there who were expecting us to get to the Realist, have faith. Some time today, this afternoon, we will get back to the Realist and the articles there.
He's itchy to get to the Realist.
Well, there's about 3 hours worth of material in there, and
3
we have
hours?
About 3 hours of reading, maybe.
Oh, no.
Reading, by me.
No.
I'm not to belittle the thing there, but there's a lot there. I should...
You insult me if you say 3 hours. My son...
I don't mean 3 hours worth of research.
No, my son Marvin was going to read the article. He hadn't read the one on Martha Mitchell yet, and he said this morning he was to stay home this morning. It'd take about 3 hours. He wanted to read the Realist. I said, look, if you read this Realist, if you read the Martha Mitchell in 3 hours, you haven't understood it. Because there's not 3 hours of reading. You've got to take a little longer. You don't know. Let's start. Okay,
so we decided we're going to have to break in a minute to identify the station in just a second, but we can't do it yet because it's not time. But in the meantime, I wanted to mention one other thing, that Paul put one of his articles on the cover next to yours. There were 2 cover stories. The cover story written by Mae is Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And next to it, Paul put his article, and the headline on that one is Will Revolution Spoil Groucho Marx?
You like that
I think
one?
both of them were written in different veins. But and then there's a caricature of Groucho Marx
sitting on a bomb.
Also, Paul indicates in this issue, which we've decided now is mainly by subscription, but possibly there'll be some newsstand copies in this area, right?
Yeah.
Paul mentions that this is another pre-anniversary issue, that he's been trying to get out the 10th anniversary issue since 1968.
I know.
And he has a whole list of editorial promises, which readers have caught him in. Every issue, he promises that this will be the 10th anniversary issue. In fact, he even says at the end of his little comments on that, that he could have made this the 13th anniversary issue, but he's going to wait until the 14th year to do that.
Jesus, that would be ridiculous. I know. I felt very guilty because I thought I was putting off his 13th anniversary issue by linking, Richard Nixon to the Charles Manson murder. But that when you begin to make those kind of statements, you've got to do a lot of research. So the 13th anniversary issue is going to come out, goodness knows when,
Now, by the way, for those who are wondering how much it costs to subscribe to the Realist, it's only $3 a year by itself.
Oh, yeah.
And that's because it's published by a non-profit corporation that doesn't make any profit off of it.
Paul makes no money at all. Get it for $3, and then when the conspiracy newsletter comes out, that's $5. The reason mine is more than his is that he's paying me for the articles. He makes me feel like a heel, like I'm making the profit, and he isn't.
Okay, I'll have faith. We will get back to the Realist and discuss some of the articles in there in just a minute while we break and identify the program and station. Be right back.
We should, I'll just read a few parts in the outline of the article and give you an idea of what it's about, Phil, for this half hour, because it's going to get a lot of attention, as I say, hopefully around the country.
Okay, it's called Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?
Yes, the article begins with this sentence: my research on political assassinations, election manipulation, and clandestine governments is not political. Democrats, as well as Republicans, contribute to murdering and concealing their crimes. That's the first page of the Realist. Then we go back to page 27, and it says, if the exposure of our CIA and its methods of operation and secret funding comes in an election year, this is a coincidence and not planned, because for 9 years I have written and telephoned public officials in the hopes that they would examine the evidence of conspiracies that exist in Washington, D.C. The Watergate affair is too large for the Democratic Party to prosecute or investigate. The best objective minds, not like the hand-picked Warren Commission, must work together, and we must follow the pieces of Scotch tape that were left in the door latches of the Watergate Hotel that led to the arrests and continue to open more and more doors. And there's a quotation by Spiro Agnew under there that applies to this article. The Greek military government that took over in 1967 has not proven itself to be as horrendous a specter to contemplate as most people thought it would. That's Spiro Agnew. There's no voting, no Beatle music, no Bob Dylan. There's church on Sunday. If you criticize the government, if you criticize Agnew, you go to jail. When he went there to visit, and a newspaper publisher said that the kids were let out of school to just make the parade look like he was a puffy. Oh, Phil's making a face. I'm wandering off to Agnew. Let's get on to the article. The article begins with the cast of characters, the 5 men who were arrested at the Watergate Hotel.
Parts of this article have already been broadcast
Yes,
here.
we've done this here. Now, the Watergate Hotel, for those of you who missed this show, because I'm always amazed at how many people have already lost track of what happened. It was only a month ago. The Watergate Hotel, located in Washington, D.C., is the home of John and Martha Mitchell, and it also is the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. And in the early morning hours of June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested moving ceiling parts from the ceiling of the 6th-floor panel in the Democratic National Headquarters. They possessed expensive electronic equipment, cameras, walkie-talkies, tools, accessories, and so forth. Now, the cast of characters, the way I did the article is I listed the description of the 5 men who were arrested: James McCord, Bernard Barker, Frank Sturgis, Mr. Martinez, Eugenio Martinez, Virgilio Gonzalez, the 4 who got away, And then in the back of the article, there's a Mr. X, a mysterious Mr. X, and I just discovered him when they went to press. So Paul had to put at the back of the article. He couldn't insert it. Mr. X is the man that Douglas Caddy, the attorney, hired, wouldn't give his name to the judge on why he was there. So that Mr. Caddy now has 4 lawyers defending him. Caddy is the attorney for the 5 men arrested. In addition to them, they're looking for Howard Hunt, a CIA man who was in the White House and had offices across the White House. He was with the CIA 21 years. And Howard Hunt has not been seen since the arrest. The 4 men that I've listed, the 4 men who got away, we only have the name of one, and is then Mr. X. Then I do a brief list, a description of other names mentioned, Howard Hunt, the one I mentioned, and Robert Bennett, the office that Hunt shared, and a description of Richard Nixon and John Mitchell and Patrick Gay. Those are my cast of characters in the drama, and there's a description of their backgrounds, how it relates to the Watergate, not just what they've accomplished in their life, but what particular things relate them to the Watergate affair as a cast of characters. And then the article goes on to John Kennedy's desire to splinter the CIA to 1,000 pieces after the Bay of Pigs, and his distrust of the CIA, and the quotation of Harry Truman that it was an American Gestapo. Then I go into the point that the same people that Kennedy feared and wanted to splinter and shred were all arrested at the Watergate and were in power today, 11 years later. Strong finance linked to that secret society of money that Nixon won't account for, the $10 million, that all the men that John Kennedy feared. And then after that, his head was blown off by the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI, and the same team were messing around with our election this time. The article, a lot of the article that is in here is not new to the regular listeners, and those that are picking it up today will have to get the Realist for the fill-in. I go into the point that Martha Mitchell liked Washington. She liked being the wife of the head of the Justice Department. She didn't want him to resign. She doesn't complain about his long hours. She isn't loony at night like they try to tell you. She was the most desirable woman in the Republican Party. She was going to be the head of a lot of luncheons down in Miami. But she saw something at the Watergate at the time of those arrests, the week of the arrest, that she was a witness to a particular team, and therefore she had to be locked away.
What did she see?
Well, one of the things she says that there were 5 men with her, and they yanked her phone off the wall and injected her.
That was in California.
She was out in California, and so was John Mitchell, and so was Patrick Gray. After the arrest, she was at a hotel at Newport Inn in California, and she says that she saw dirty work and she saw dirty things.
Where? But what did she see in
where.
What did she see in the Watergate?
Well, she didn't say whether she saw at the Watergate Hotel where she actually lives, you see, or she didn't say if she saw that in California. She saw 5 men in California, and the White House, John Mitchell and Richard Nixon had a conference and said that she only had 1 guard, so she was left with 4 extra men unaccounted for. Well, when the men were arrested at the Watergate, there were 9 men at the hotel. 5 were arrested and 4 got away. So the question, we brought this up on another show, were the 4 men that she saw, the 4 that got away, was John Mitchell, former head of the Justice Department and still an important man in the whole United States in directing the link of Rockefeller to the White House to Richard Nixon through this whole clandestine government. He's one of the connecting links. Did he help in any way hide 4 men who were sought by the federal authorities, by the police? He hired one of the men who was arrested, had a paycheck. He was employed by the committee to re-elect Nixon that John Mitchell headed. So one of the men was his employee. The Monterey Herald had an article this week, I don't know if you saw it, that Bernard Barker, one of the suspects that was arrested, made 15 telephone calls from Miami to the committee to elect Richard Nixon. He was supposed to be the Democrat, but he had direct links to Mitchell's office there. See, they're linking him. The Monterey Herald had an article this week linking him. So we don't know what Martha Mitchell saw, but we have a right to find out. And one of the points I make in the article is that as a civil suit, as a friend of the court, I can sue the court to find out what she saw. You see, part of the Civil Rights Act was that you can't hide. The judge can't hide information of a witness if he has it. See, down in the South, it started in the South, all these lynchings and the bombings of the church, and everyone who got up there says, well, we don't know anything, we don't know, and the judge says, not guilty. Well, then, if the judge is hiding information, he goes to jail. You see, on the civil rights thing, to stop the process of being protected by the laws. In the article, I say Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and parts of that act were violated at the time of Martha Mitchell's abduction and in the way she was handled. Her telephone was pulled from the wall, 5 men silenced her, and an unknown substance was injected into her body against her will. As a friend of the court and a citizen, I have a right to charge there's been a violation of her civil rights by those in responsible positions, and it is in the national interest that she be permitted to talk freely before a responsible group. We want to know what she saw. Martha Mitchell's the wife of one of the most responsible men in the nation, and when she's treated in this manner, all of us are involved in having a right to know who is doing these things, and what happened to her could happen to any of us. Those guilty of making her a prisoner are subject to $10,000 fine and 10 years in jail, and if a conspiracy is proven, each and every person is involved and subject to the same penalties. The national interest is involved, you see. That is the problem. See, here's the point. First I have to show I'm talking about John Lennon. He's caught in a trap now. He's caught in the same trap that Martha Mitchell and all people. It's not a far-out hippie, person and the wife of John Mitchell are worlds apart until the police state wants them for various reasons because they're functioning in a certain way. And say, we have a right to know what happened to Martha Mitchell. Well, if I have screamed and yelled, you want to know what happened to James Ray. See, he's in a court, locked up, no one can see him. And I've talked to black leaders, all over this country, all over this state, written them. I have copies of letters saying, and in this city, people in this community I've talked to, Jane Van Hook, she ran for office, public office in town. She works at Public Defender's Office here.
Legal Aid Society.
Legal Aid Society. I've talked to Pearl Carey. I've talked to people in this city. I say, look, why don't you want to know what happened to Martin Luther King? I have a lot of friends in this community. But I said, don't you know that's going to affect your life someday? Because if they can do that to James Ray, hire him and kill Martin Luther King and not find the killers, then they're going to get you. Don't you know you're next? I plead with them to join me for their own sake, not for my sake, just for their own survival. It's in the books that they'll be wiped out. That's part of the King Alfred plan, to rip off all the leaders, go down to the next educate. And I always say that the clearing of the jungles in Brazil and the Amazons is to make ready for the supersonics, and they have the NASA has these large radio controls over there that can go all over the world and connect to the Texas and New Orleans area that is completely ready. The headquarters of this fascist state was going to be the Southwest. And I've said this, and I say, well, don't you want to know what happened to James Ray? Because that matters. You see, what happened to James Ray matters to John Lennon now. But there's no person famous enough or public enough who will listen to me until they're trapped. I've reached everyone that I could in my lifetime. I've been doing this work. Only when they're up against the wall. They say, well, tell me about your work. What do you know? Do you know this man? Do you know that man? Is he an agent? Is that one agent? Who's hurting us? Who's helping us? Is this one clean? Can we see this one? Who's his lawyer? See, you get trapped, and then it's too late. You see, that's the whole thing about the civil rights law, but nobody's used it. It's been here since '64, and I got this advice from an attorney here in Carmel who read my Watergate story to make sure that I wouldn't be sued for libel, because this issue of the Realist is heavy. There's a lot of heavy stuff. I've got about 20 pages here of really heavy material. And if you read it, and I wanted to make sure, I know my facts. I know what I'm saying is true, but I want to make sure it isn't libelous. So the Martha Mitchell thing, she's a prisoner.
So that's one article you've got in there.
Yeah, and that's the part of one article. And then I go into the Louis Tackwood allegations in this article, that how he felt that the government was going to be overthrown, and Squad 19 that we've talked on the show, that the purpose of having provocateurs at the 1972 conventions was planned violence on the part of our state criminal conspiracy section, Evel Younger, I mention him all the time, and the FBI, he's part of the FBI, and the national organization that wanted violence, the Republican Party, and could create martial law. And then after that, they would kill Nixon. And that's in the article, too. The connection of the Squad 19 plans to my research and tying it. Now, I tried to tie it in to the Watergate Hotel. And there's a section here called How Do You Recognize a CIA Espionage Plot from a Third-Rate Burglary? Because at the time it happened, Richard Nixon called it a third-rate burglary. So the first part of the article is, historically, what happened at the Bay of Pigs, who was at the hotel from the Bay of Pigs, what happened to the CIA, who was at the arrest from the CIA, what did Tackwood say, how the country was going to be overthrown, how did these people link? So then I have a section, how do you recognize a CIA espionage plot? And I go into 13 ways you recognize it. I could have gone longer, but we wanted to get this press before the Republican convention and get out this week, and the issues will be out in New York this week. So I stopped at number 13, but I could go on to other categories. I had to have a cutoff date. That was part of the trouble of writing when you're writing something this important and serious, and you've got a cutoff date because we were a week late. But the information that was coming in delayed me because I had certain articles coming in that week. And I would take one article from the Washington Post or the New York Times, because a lot of people wonder where do you get your sources of information. The Monterey Herald had one article this week. Maybe I break it into 11 categories, that one article. Well, then you've got to rewrite your thing because you've got your categories.
So
back to this one. How do you recognize a CIA plot like the Watergate Hotel from a third-rate burglary? I listed 13 ways you can. One is the use of the cover story. Everything has a cover story which has no basis in fact later, but is used to make use it back and accept it. Therefore, believe everything's well and safe in the land. Deniability always follows a CIA conspiracy. As soon as a person is caught, if they're caught, everyone cuts off relationships and nobody knows anybody else. They don't say, oh, sure, that's my brother-in-law. Yeah, that's my organization. They say, no, I never heard of them. And so deniability is very heavy because everybody cuts off with everyone else because they've got other jobs to do after that, you see. So they don't want to blow this. And then there's dummy front organizations that don't exist. They use names and organizations of businesses and employments that are no such place, like the organization that Lee Harvey Oswald worked at for Fair Play for Cuba. If you walked up the stairs on one street, if you walked in a building back to back on the other street, went upstairs, it was the same office for the CIA. You know, one is a CIA office with Guy Bannister and David Ferry and the whole gang, and the other front office on Canal Street is Fair Play for Cuba. And it's back to back, the same doors connect. You know, just like your KLRB, you have a back door and a front door, and the middle door is where they meet. See? Okay. So they've got funding. The source of funding of a CIA operation is never direct, you see. And then there's the communications and radio control, because always radio comes in. There's a getaway car with a radio band in the Tippett thing. There's radio bands in the Martin Luther King thing. The radio in the tied up to the police bands in Arthur Bremer's car. Always radio communications. They have to have it because they have to know what to do in event, or is this covered? They can't get caught. It's not just a guy standing there shooting who doesn't have a band or a radio department. Arthur Bremer doesn't have it. See, there's radio. Then there's the aliases. They never use their names. They use Heidel, like Oswald used Heidel, and James Ray had, when he left the penitentiary, and I have in the article, he had a security card under the name of Raines ready for him that you don't print in the penitentiaries, you know, ready for a job. There's always your aliases. Then there's your job changes, because you lead a certain life and you're a student, or you work at a car's place, or you're in the police force. Then they say, well, you get into this particular, this is going to be a conspiracy on a need-to-know basis, but they don't want you to be traced. So you lose all chain of command for 2 years. So everyone involved always changes jobs and locations, and in the event he's caught, he's not linked to his former employer job. See? So I made a term up called migratory birds for my research, where people change. And then there's your housing, double housing, because you lose your other home. Like you lose your name and you lose your job, well, you can't stay home and be, you know, if you're Phil Kogan and you're going to do an assignment 2 years, so now you got to be something else. You can't be home with the same wife and the same name. You got to go somewhere else. So you've got to have another house. And then wherever that house is, if you're losing yourself and you're working for the post office, the post office guys come to see you, you have to have another location where you do your espionage work, because you can't have the espionage people and the straight people meeting. You're leading a straight life, but you're involved in a conspiracy, so you have to have double housing. And this works in every one of the cases. This is why I could recognize the Watergate, because I'd broken it down in the Oswald, in the Manson thing, in the Sirhan, the James Ray, the killing of Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and the Chappaquiddick, the dunking of Ted Kennedy, and all of these conspiracy things people have double roles. Then there's the local police, the military, the Treasury, the Justice, and the FBI. You can't do it without their help. Certain members, not all of them, but special tax SWATs, criminal conspiracy section, there are certain people that know how to pick up, like if the local policeman arrests Arthur Bremer, he only has him just a few hours. He couldn't even go to the hospital to get treatment. They called the White House for permission. I have an article. Richard Nixon gave permission for Arthur Bremer to go to the hospital and get stitches on his head or hurt because he was hurt by the crowd, if the FBI is there. And when he walks out of the hospital, he's under the custody of the Federal Bureau of Investigation from then on. The local police, if they're straight, don't ever get the case. The local policeman, the homicide, want to do the autopsy of John Kennedy, and they come in, they say, you can't take his body. It's a plain homicide. They say, yeah, we're taking it. Johnson says it goes to Bethesda, and off goes John Kennedy's body, and the local police don't get that body. So some policemen are in and some aren't. So don't get nervous, local policemen. You're not all part of a conspiracy. And I don't think police are pigs, and I'm not anti-police. And if my house is robbed, I call the police. I'm not calling a hippie like they say, that car bumper. If your house is robbed, call a hippie. I believe in the police, but there are special men, like a certain man in the Carmel Police Department that's come up from the L.A. Police Department, from a special department. And one of my friend's son was busted, and a phony rap was put on him. And the judge threw it out, but he was harassed. He could have had a felony. The kid couldn't have been able to vote in this next election. He went to court here. He was supposed to go to New York to his father this summer. He was held up. They had to get the expense of lawyers. They have to prove their innocence. And the man who got him is a local policeman who came from L.A., who should be watched. The local boys are okay, but it's those importations, migratory birds again, that bring your community trouble. They lose their locations, they come to new communities, and there's special tax squads, and those are the people who are going to get stuff. Okay, so you've got your cities and your countries. Certain cities and countries are involved in every conspiracy. And then there's what we call coincidences that are never coincidences, but they call them coincidences, and some are funny, and some aren't. And then there's witnesses that are never called and questions never asked. Now, the importance of the Watergate story is that through the news media, and I hope, and there's going to be a lot of press coverage and maybe a press conference in L.A. There's talk about setting one up. Paul didn't know if he wanted it. Don Freed, the publisher and co-writer of the Squad 19 with Louis Tackwood, wants it. So we may have it. We'll be in touch with all the news media in the next 2 weeks because I want all the questions answered. See, this thing went to press with only a few questions in it, but it is a can of worms when it opens up. It's going to be a big story and a good story, Phil, because there's a lot of questions here. And I tied in 9 years of research to the Watergate Hotel, and hopefully people will begin to see how. See, nobody's ever written a book on how these things apply to our present problem. What I have here, witnesses not called, I've broken down 13 categories, and I could have gone for 27. On how every conspiracy case applies to these kind of operations. We'll say the espionage system, you read The Invisible Government, and he may talk about deniability, or the Pentagon Papers talks about the deniability of Kogan. But I'm taking a particular arrest in Washington and tying it into the plan to overthrow the government, which I said would happen. And how these men maybe, see what I'm hoping is that it could be stopped if you expose it before. You see why it's a big story? We're hoping that we can stop it by exposing it. And because there's two things in our favor, there's always been a news blackout on assassinations and on what happens in this country. But we've got two things in our favor now. And there's books out about assassinations, and people, are confused about the CIA. But what's in our favor is that you have Martha Mitchell, who's a woman, and women and women's organizations and women's libs are worrying because she is an actual prisoner. She is an actual prisoner. She's been injected. She's been put to sleep. She's been flown to New York. She's isolated. She's not with her child now. She's an actual prisoner. And you have a case pending. And Richard Nixon asked, please don't have the arrest lawsuit now because it'll hurt the Democratic Party. Richard Nixon asked that. And I have that in the article. I wanted the article...
It'll hurt the Democratic Party or the Republican?
He asked the Democratic Party not to sue the Republican Party on the arrest till after the elections because it would hurt his elections. This is what he said. The Committee for the Re-election of the President is worried that a hearing on a suit involved in the break-in and bugging attempt would cause incalculable damage to President Nixon's campaign. The committee asked the U.S. District Court to postpone suit against them until after November the 7th election, because it said it could deter the campaign workers and contributions and force disclosure of confidential information and provide the Democrats with a reason to hold a news conference. He was afraid that, he said it would cause incalculable damage to President Nixon. Now,
maybe it should be heard.
What I want to say, there's one other thing I want to say. People called in last week, Phil, while you were away, and wanted to know about McGovern and voting about McGovern and what I thought about his chances, and my opinion about it. And I like what he said. I like his acceptance speech. I went to a Democratic Party this week. My neighbor, Mrs. Campisi, across the street, has been an active Democrat, and she has invited me in the Democratic Party for years. I was a registered Democrat when John Kennedy was in office. I heard his acceptance speech at the L.A. Coliseum in 1960, took the kids with a picnic box lunch, just like I took them to see the Beatles. I want them to be a part of their history and their times if I can, as a mother, and I did these things. Well, after Kennedy was killed and I was doing my work by 64, I knew Lyndon Johnson was in on this thing, and I wasn't going to support him, and I wouldn't do that campaign. And 66, I was up here, and the Democratic Party looked up registered Democrat. Would you help us? I don't support assassins, Democrats or Republicans. I will not touch your party until you find out who killed John Kennedy. Oh, you don't say these things. You don't say that. That's terrible. Don't talk this way. The years went on. They worked for... Mrs. Green came down here to manage the campaign. She worked for worked for Stevenson. She worked for John Kennedy. She worked for Bobby Kennedy. So she was out at this luncheon at the Democratic Party. She'd been to Miami. She was going to tell about experience. So I thought, is the McGovern team any different than the people that surround John Kennedy and Bobby that let them be killed? Larry O'Brien, or Schlesinger, Salinger, those cop-outs. They keep the same job when the boy is killed. They still keep the same jobs, the same money. They're still written up in Life and Newsweek. How do they care? What do they care? So I said to Mary Green, I walked up to her afterwards and I said, did they talk about the Watergate Hotel in Miami at the time of the convention? The Miami convention was July the 3rd to 10th. The Watergate arrest was June the 19th. So by that time, I was so heavy into my work, realizing what happened there. Didn't anyone down there understand who was in their place? She looked at me like drop-dead chick and turned her back to me and talked to someone else and said, no. Like, don't you dare talk about what happened. Well, here, let me put something really clear on the radio station. The President of the United States, Richard Nixon, is saying, please don't open up that case. It will hurt my cause. It will do incalculable damage to the president's campaign. And the Democrats are too stupid to even talk to you about that subject. That's the one thing they have going for them, and they're too stupid to even talk. They don't even know who would kill McGovern. They don't care. They may not like me saying that. They don't care. But Schlesinger comes through town. He's Mr. CIA. And so if I tell you young people, go vote for McGovern, go vote for a corpse, that's what they would let him be. They don't care. And Mary Green on the Peninsula, who wants you to, all you young McGovern people, to go out, go ask her why she won't talk about the Watergate. I just said to her, I didn't say anything except, I said, did anyone talk about the Watergate? She didn't turn to me and just smile and say, isn't that far out that they were arrested? As a person to a person, a human being, communication, laughing like we caught them, didn't we? If we're on the same side, then we should at least know that we have something going for us. But unless she's an enemy of mine, and I don't know what she is. I don't know what she is, but the fact that she doesn't want you on the peninsula or me or to communicate to me about the Watergate means that you McGovern people with a halo on your head and starry-eyed, you're going to change America? you're going to end up like John Lennon, trapped in a cage. That's the prognosis. Don't put the McGovern sticker on your car and think you're going to save America, because if the McGovern people don't care about the overthrow of America, they don't care about you. It's just that simple.
Mae Brussell.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy, a public affairs presentation of KLRB News. If you have questions that you want answered on future programs, or any comments, write Dialogue Conspiracy, KLRB, Box 3904, Carmel, California 93921. I'm Phil Kogan.
KLRB FM in Carmel.